Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second webinar of Detecting and Defending Against Cyber Threats, a short course presented by IT Masters on behalf of Charles Sturt University. My name's Guy Coward and I'll MC this webinar, and your mentor is Georg Thomas, who I'll ask you to welcome shortly. Before we begin, just the usual housekeeping. We still encourage questions and the use of chat during our webinars. We ask that you direct all questions relevant to course content to the Q&A section, and that you send all administration type questions, dates, times, resource availability, and the like to the support team in chat. You can chat with panelists only or to your fellow students as well, and you can make that choice by toggling through the drop-down box once you've opened the chat log. As I'm pretty well constantly saying, there are some very experienced attendees who have great insights that can augment our content, so I recommend keeping everyone in the loop. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, or if a question is particularly relevant, I'll interject during George's discussion. Hannah and Rebecca are here in support for IT Masters, so thank you both. Hannah is also responsible for the course page, which is where you'll find the other materials needed for this course, links to readings and discussion forums and quizzes and so on. Please welcome back Georg, who as of this week is officially Dr. Thomas. It's been cleared up, so that's good news. Last week, for those who new to the course, we had a sort of introductory and framing webinar, and this week's going to include some demos, which sound very exciting. So yeah, if this is your first webinar, you can catch up on the recording at the course page. Hello, Georg. Good to speak with you again. What security tales have you got for us this week?
Thanks, Guy. Welcome back, everybody. As Guy just mentioned, it's going to be a little bit different today. So I guess, as I mentioned last week, week one was a very kind of high-level introduction of the course. I did mention that the demo was going to be in week 4, but I think given some of the feedback and reading through the comments and so forth, I thought it would be useful, and I like demos. I thought it would be useful to sort of demonstrate some practical applications of what we'll be going through today. And so in terms of today, we are going to focus on defense. Obviously part of the defense and detection. And as I said, we're going to split it into 2 parts. The first part will be theory. Yeah, sorry. But we're going to be discussing strategies at a fairly high level, and the idea is to give anyone that is potentially new or needs a refresh, some sort of background on some defensive strategies. And then in the second part of tonight's session, we're going to move into a more practical, technical demonstration where maybe I won't spoil it. I mean, if you've kind of had a look at the slides on the website, you probably see there's some sneaky screenshots in there. That's really because sometimes the demo gods don't play nice. They did this morning, so hopefully it all goes without a hitch. But anyway, let's begin. So in terms of topics tonight, I'm going to cover 4 topics. The first one is governance, and we'll get into what those are shortly. Technical controls, which obviously you probably be familiar with, audit and compliance, and then talk about some active and passive defense type strategies. So governance. So I guess at the heart of any security program is governance. And so this is where we talk about things like policies, procedures, guidelines, those sorts of artifacts that really determine what the principles are of a information security program. And there are many I guess examples of typical policies that organizations will implement. Now, it's not common for policies to not exist within organizations, but generally, having solid policies in place that are approved at a board level are strongly recommended. Having providing guidance of what is and isn't allowed. And what I wanted to talk about, I'll talk about some examples of policies. And once again, sorry if this little bit of content's a bit dry, but that's what I thought I'll put some of the more exciting stuff a little bit later. And in terms of policies, things like information security policies, acceptable use policies, these are all the types of things that organizations should have in some way, shape, or form, and should be reviewed on a fairly regular basis. When I say regular, at least once a year. And if anybody has gone down the ISO 27001 journey or is familiar with it, you'll know that a big part of that is governance and having policies. And so what I thought I'd talk about is some of the security frameworks that are pretty well known or well adopted across the world, or and given that I'm sitting in Melbourne and in Australia. And so the first one, as I said, was ISO 27001, and it's been around since 95, although at that time it was a British standards, I guess, framework, and it became ISO in 2000, so it became an internationally recognized standard in 2000, and then there was a revision in 2005, and then in 2013 we have the current version. So for anyone that's familiar with 27001, I think from memory, there's about, I think 114 controls, which are, sort of broken up into the sort of governance piece with policies and procedures and things like, internal audit and so forth. And then there's a second part of that, which is what they call the annex controls, which are the sort of things that are used to treat risk. And this is where your sort of cyber sort of controls will sit alongside those particular areas. And some of you may have seen other versions of 27001, like you might have seen 2018 edition. That is actually the same as 2013 for anyone that's wondering. And it is generally just something like a language change for a particular region, but it is actually the same thing. It also has some supporting sort of standards like 005 for risk management, or 31000 is also risk management. There's basically, that's the 27000 series. So the next one that's very, very commonly seen is the NIST cybersecurity framework. I know we touched on it a little bit last week. So the NIST framework is from the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US, which is a government department that I guess publishes standards for technology used by the US government. But I think I mentioned last week that these standards they're freely available and they're widely adopted by private sector and by international organizations. I know of at least one bank that uses in Australia that uses the NIST cybersecurity framework as part of their security program. A lot of them use ISO 27001, but NIST is fairly popular, and NIST is sort of broken down into, I think it's 5 areas, which are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And I probably should have done the little spinny wheel, but this is around identifying risk, protecting against those risks, detecting threats, responding to those threats, and then recovering. So it's a very, I guess, fairly pragmatic framework in the way it works, and one that has fairly good adoption. In Australia, we have the Australian Government's Information Security Manual. So I can't remember how many controls are on this thing. I think it actually shrank probably, I think, last year. From memory, if anyone knows, feel free to drop a message in. I think it's like 800 or so, or 800 and something. So it's similar again to, probably more closely aligned with NIST's 853 framework, which is their sort of full security framework, the sort of the big one. It's broken up into the same sort of, into different areas, like around audit and around physical access and things like that. So it's a lot more, I guess, a bit deeper than the cybersecurity framework. It also is based around classification of information. And so information classification, for anyone that's not familiar with that, is where you identify how sensitive information is and you effectively like tag or label it. So you may have seen, if you've ever received anything from, from a government agency, you might see, unofficial or unclassified, or you might see something like, secret, or probably not, but effectively the information security manual is structured that the more sensitive the information is, the more stringent control, the more controls, the more stringent they are in terms of application. And one thing that's really taken off, I think, especially in Australia, is the ACSC Essential 8. So, and both the Australian Government Information Security Manual and the AC Essential 8 used to be known as the ASD Information Security Manual and the ASD Essential 8, which is the Australian Signals Directorate, which is our signals intelligence agency. And I think in the last maybe the last 18 months, they've sort of shifted that around a little bit, and the ACSC falls under the ASD, and which is the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, and they have the Essential 8 controls. And these controls are very technical, and effectively, if I can remember all 8 of them off the top of my head, application whitelisting is definitely the first one, and I might have these out of order. You've got patching applications, patching operating systems, user application hardening. There is multi-factor authentication, removing administrator rights. I'm getting close. How many have we got left? 1. Backup. There you go.
Well done.
So once again, feel free to chat if I got any of those wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's them. That might even have been in order.
Macros.
Oh, Office macros. Yeah. No, I guess I can't count. So yeah, restricting Office macros. That is one of them. So it's I guess a very useful set of guidance or useful framework. I've implemented it before, yep, including application whitelisting, and we will talk about that in a minute. So that's really the governance stuff, very kind of high level, very sort of not instructional, but designed to provide some sort of standard. I mean, there are others. If you talk about specific things like cloud, the CSA, Cloud Security Alliance, they have their CSA Cloud Controls Matrix, which is, once again, similar layout. It has, domains and specific controls specifically for cloud environments. CIS do the CIS critical security controls in the top 20. There's heaps of them out there, but these are the ones that I probably have the most familiarity with, and the CCM. I probably should have added that. Anyway, let's talk about technical controls. So this is not an exhaustive list.
So George, just before we do get to that one,
go backwards.
Yeah, just of course there's questions about which one to use when, and how you can combine them and these sorts of things. Have you got any sort of broad throwaway lines you can sort of say about which one when?
Yes, so good point. So the first one there, ISO IEC 27001 2013, yes, that is a mouthful, is the only one of those that is certifiable. So if, in terms of security frameworks, and someone might be sitting on the other end going, wait, what about something like SOC 2 Type 2? Yeah, okay, that's certifiable too. But when I think about, that's an audit, and I guess I will get to auditing, but it is certifiable. So what happens with ISO 27001 is, if the organization wants to get a certificate on the wall to say, hey, we're ISO 27001, or to say, hey, we're certified in some sort of information security management system, which ISMS, which is what ISO 27001 is a standard for, then that's the one that will offer that. There are definitely arguments for why it's good and why it's not. One of the big things that comes with ISO 27001 that I think has been a very common criticism is that it is not prescriptive. It is based on risks as they are identified by the organization. And so why is that an issue? Because it's very subjective, what I think is important, others may not, and vice versa. And one of the, I guess, things with 27001 is when I talked about those annex controls where you select what controls you apply, the organization gets to choose which ones they apply based on the risk assessment that they have completed. And they also get to choose the scope of the certification. So, one of the things that happens sometimes is an organization may only scope one specific business unit or one specific platform or product, and then might say, hey, we're ISO 27001 certified, when, yeah, that's true, but the scope is quite narrow and it might not cover everything. And so the advice that I have in that instance is, if you're assessing an organization that's 27001, is to ask for a copy of that statement of applicability, that SOA document, because it will tell you exactly what was actually in scope. So that's probably gone a bit too on about that, but that's the 27001. The cybersecurity framework, I think, it's not as big and bulky as 27001. Often organizations that are, not wanting to invest the time and money and compliance requirements of 001, because 001 requires frequent auditing. So there's an external audit by an external company at the start, and then there's a surveillance audit the following 2 years, and then there's a re-certification. And between those intervals, you have to also do internal audit, where you have someone basically validate those controls on an ongoing basis to make sure that they're in place. And that can be quite cumbersome for especially smaller organizations. And so something like the CSF, which has gained a lot of popularity, both for like my experience in the US and here, and effectively when I was in the US, it tended to be almost a shift where a lot of organizations that were looking at 27001 thought, well, this is a bit much, and looked at the CSF, the cybersecurity framework. You can't get certified, but it's still a well-regarded and sort of robust framework. The ISM is really more for organizations that are either in government or supplying services to government. Now, obviously, once again, it's publicly available. Anyone can implement the controls in the ISM, but it is pretty full on. Like, it is huge. I did an audit of a government organization maybe a year ago that said, oh, we want to get to, we're implementing the ISM and we want to know how we're going, and, let us know what we need to do to, become compliant. And I think, and they did, it wasn't at that time, it wasn't mandatory for them to do it, but we kind of went through the audit and went, well, this is how much work you got to do. And they went, ooh, that's a lot. Because it's very, very specific.
Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, right. And then, as I said, the ACSC is only 8 controls. So, it's very small, it's very specific, and it does have a maturity model rating where, and it's been revised now, I think there's 3 maturity models, level 1, 2, and 3, where, sort of, if you're fully compliant, you're a level 3, and then it kind of goes backwards from there. It's a really good, I guess, starting point for many organizations. If you're kind of wondering what are the sort of things that you should probably look at now in terms of what will make the biggest impact to your organization, the ACSC Essential 8 is probably a good place to start. We did that. I started with the ACSC Essential 8 in my current organization, and then moved to 27001 certification. So did it that way.
Thanks heaps. So I guess you could just say it depends. And I think it would be a really useful forum discussion. Chris is asking about a particular context, the school context, and I imagine it would be, I guess, really context dependent. So a great forum discussion for everyone to sort of trade their stories and experiences using the different frameworks.
I can't see the chat, but yeah, feel free to like point me to that question later, and I can I can put something in there.
Yeah. Honestly, I just think the forum, like, just start a thread saying, "Oh, let's talk frameworks," because there's going to be heaps of useful stuff for people in there.
Yeah, perfect. Happy to do that, and I'll give you my 2 cents. So technical controls. These are probably the most common things, or the most common controls or areas that people work with. This list is definitely not exhaustive. I would be here all day if I probably put, you know, every single thing. These are probably the more common ones. You know, talking about things like antivirus, anti-malware. I mean, these are the, when I say, you know, technical defensive controls. You know, app whitelisting, previously not really widely used. I know if I wind the clock back about maybe 12 years, I tried app whitelisting. It was definitely in its infancy, and it was definitely a bit of a disaster. It's moved a lot since then, and there are platforms out there that and products that do a really good job of app whitelisting. As I said, it's the #1 control on the ACSC Essential 8. And for those that I think most of you, if not all of you, will know what antivirus, anti-malware is. But app whitelisting, the idea behind app whitelisting is you basically block every executable from running, and you whitelist those executables. So, you know, software programs, browser extensions, scripts, you whitelist, or DLLs, you whitelist them from running based on things like where they're running from, the publisher of the particular, so, you know, you can digitally sign an application. So for example, Microsoft sign all applications with a certificate to say this is Microsoft as the publisher, or the most common one is a hash. So if, hashing the particular, and so I'm probably not going to go into defining what hashing is. Hopefully it's been discussed in one of the other courses, but basically it's taking like a it uses cryptography to take a sort of to kind of run the file through, you know, a mathematical algorithm to spit out a specific string, I guess, which will always be the same, providing that that file is the integrity is maintained. So that sounded very technical, but anyway, so app whitelisting, AAA, so authentication, authorization, and accounting. So this is basically around sort of access control and, you know, basically identifying who a user is, making sure they have access to the resource, and then logging that. Encryption, so basically, you know, jumbling everything up so it can't be read. Firewalls, so typically on the edge or sometimes within network segments, so being able to filter traffic through the use of firewalls. And then the intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems. I don't know why I put systems in there, that's like PIN number. Intrusion prevention systems. But, you know, having the detection of, you know, anomalous behavior or known bad signatures, often incorporated into firewall devices and blocking and you know, blocking threats that way. So those are the sort of, I guess, technical controls. Anyone have any questions on the technical controls thing? Guy, I don't know if there's anything that's popped up. I see the little number go up, so I'm like,
yeah. AAA is mostly applied in networking. Is that right?
Yes.
From Lungasani. Are there any app whitelisting solutions, or do we need it, or do we need to do it with SCCM?
No, so there's a few app whitelisting solutions. Microsoft have their own inbuilt app whitelisting solution called AppLocker. It's built into Windows from, I think, Windows 7. It's definitely in Windows 8 and above, but Windows 7 is built in there. We're actually going to have a quick sticky beak at that later. We're going to look at it. There are other third-party vendors that do app whitelisting, Carbon Black, for example, Carbon Black Protection. I think there's one called, is it Digital Guardian? Is that, sometimes I get confused between app whitelisting and DLP. There's a few of them out there. I don't think SCCM does it. Intune may be able to do it. But yeah, the one that comes natively with Windows is AppLocker, and the other one that I've used is Carbon Black. So yeah, those are the two that
Cool.
I'm most familiar with.
Yeah, we'll save the rest of the questions for after the session. Let's keep going.
Cool. And then I guess the next thing is audit and compliance. So this is really around validating those defenses. So things like ongoing vulnerability assessment. So scanning to make sure that that the patching is up to date, that default configurations have been removed, that sort of thing. Doing that on an ongoing basis. The more frequent, the better. I know that I set up most of my vulnerability assessment scans to run weekly. Things like ethical hacking, security testing, and I sort of put pen testing down there as a subset because for me and ethical hacking takes into account other things like social engineering. So like your phishing campaigns and your tailgating and that sort of stuff, where penetration testing tends to be more specifically focused on systems. But those types of things those types of tests are important. You've got the concept now. Historically, we had a lot of the sort of red team exercises where you have you engage a consulting company to be the threat actor, and they're the red team, and they try and attack your systems and get in. To now what we have, and the blue team was the internal team that was defending against the red team. And now, we're starting to move to this concept of purple teaming, where there's a lot more collaboration, and the red team will do a test, but the blue team know that there's a test. And the idea is that, well, the red team go, hey, did you see anything? And the blue team go, no. And then they go, well, that's not good. To help, identify those gaps a bit more effectively than having just a one-sided point and shoot and then hoping the other party catch it. So those are the sorts of engagements that we're seeing more of. As I said before, with certifications like ISO 27001, you've got those ongoing certification audits annually, and then those internal audits that may be quarterly that run, and then any other monitoring and measurement that happens, and that might be reporting to the board or reporting to a risk committee, or just within the team, just to make sure that the controls are operating effectively. So. Cool. All right, we're gonna have a very quick comparison of active and passive defense, just because that comes up, and then we're gonna go into that whole demo thing. All right, so passive defense. I know I put active and passive, and then I sort of flipped it and went passive, but anyway. So these are the more common controls.
How dare you?
I know. I know. I think I did that because traditionally defense has been more passive. And then as we're sort of evolved over the last, few years, we're kind of moving to, and that doesn't say that, that's not to say that passive has gone away. It's definitely still there and it is absolutely necessary. But now there's this, it's being augmented by adding active defense controls. So passive is the stuff that we sort of talked about before, which is, the firewalls, the application whitelisting, the access controls, device hardening. So, and I know that someone did post on the forum and see me doing it about the CIS benchmarks and using those to harden devices and put best security configurations in. Your antivirus, your anti-malware, although some of that antivirus, anti-malware stuff is now sort of shifting with their sort of advanced endpoint threat into more active defense. And so when I talk about active defense, we're talking about more real-time defense. And so examples of that, things like SIEM, so your security information event management. So you like, your what do you call it? Splunk, Logarithm, QRadar, Alien Vault, yeah, Alien Vault. All those, Greylog. Your anomaly detection. So as traffic's going through, identifying something that looks malicious, and then having somebody review that. Your threat intelligence type, exercises, and then finally that incident management to respond. And I guess the thing is, when you look at active defense, the burden on personnel is typically a lot higher than on passive defenses. So often, it requires full-time, almost, eyes on glass, looking at what's going on in terms of when you're thinking about active defense versus the passive stuff, which is just almost I'm not going to say a set and forget because you can't really set and forget, but it's a lot more, funnily enough, passive. And there's a typo. That's all right. I'll fix that later. Sorry. So I found this chart, which I thought was pretty interesting. Kind of helps to sort of show where the sort of line is, and I just thought someone might find that useful. So that's in the deck. All right. That's the theory. So we survived. I'm going to move on. So if anyone's got any questions, now's a good time. Otherwise,
Now I say we just go straight into the demo. People love this stuff. I'm certainly very excited, and we'll keep the questions for after. So let's get into it.
cool.
But after, we'll read this very important caveat.
Yes. So this is for educational purposes, which is good because we're learning. Don't try these. It's not don't try these at home. It's like absolutely try these at home, but only at home. Unless you're going to be a pen tester or ethical hacker, then providing you've got permission, then feel free to do that as long as you're allowed.
Oh, now's a good time though, George, to ask about why and quickly getting back into your why just do it at home, and I'll quickly plug your even though you didn't ask me to, your thesis. I'm going to share it in the chat so you can all go and have a look at it.
Oh, okay. Why what? Why do a thesis?
What stops you? No. What stops you from from doing it for bad? What stops you being a malicious actor?
Number one, orange is not my color. So
okay,
prison outfit. So I guess it goes, and look, to be completely honest, I mean it's going at some point. It's gone through my head. Well, man, I could make a lot of money if I was a crook, probably, but then I get caught and go to jail, and that wouldn't be good. So there's obviously that consequence, that consequentialist view of this is not a good idea. So that's first and foremost probably one of the key things. The other thing is obviously around the sort of ethics of it, and I like to think that and ethics is really hard to define, but trust me, I have a thesis on ethics, but which is the other thing. But given that I believe that I behave ethically and morally, it would be wrong of me to use my skills for badness, to do those sort of illegal things that and I've seen firsthand what happens when people get when people get scammed or they get hacked. Like I've seen it. I've responded to incidents. I know of people that have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I'm not talking just businesses. I know businesses that have lost that sort of money, but even individuals, like even only recently, someone that I knew, like their parent was sort of scammed out of a lot of money. So I think I prefer to be on the other side of the fence to try and prevent these things, rather than being in it for me and trying to make money out of this sort of thing. So by stealing other people's money.
Beauty, thanks. I've chucked your thesis in the chat, so everyone should go and have a look at it. And play nice.
Really good if you can't sleep. No, it is pretty interesting, especially if you're in legal. But it does have application outside of that as well. So
thanks.
Cool. So demo. I know I said demo, but this is the only diagram. So this is just a quick kind of what we're going to go through. So effectively today, we're going to, so I can't really point. Is there like a pointer? Anyway, it's on the left there with a little skull on the laptop. That's this me. Okay, cool. And then on the other side, we've got also me as the victim. So what we're going to do today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to I'm going to do a fish. And I'm going to capture some credentials. So what I'm trying to show here is compromise on a couple of different levels. So one of those is going to be a fish, and then I'm also going to do a you know, trying to exploit a poorly patched system. And then what we'll do after that is try and, you know, show some, I guess, either talk about or show some sort of strategies to prevent this sort of thing. So let's see what happens here. Oh, that's handy. Okay, cool. So can we see this?
Yep, looking pretty good.
Cool. All right, so this is Parrot. So, you know, Parrot is a Linux distribution. It is used for security testing. It contains a lot of tools that are nicely categorized. I know that somebody last week did ask about the different tools and what they do. I actually did have the link for that, but I couldn't find the question in the forum. Maybe I'll just post it. Kali Linux is one that's also very widely used. But, you know, if you kind of go through here, you could sort of see, and we're going to go down to, I've gone blind, what's going on here? Not that one. Exploitation tools. We're going to go down to this social engineering toolkit thing here. So this is kind of just quickly demonstrating how quickly you can spin up a social engineering campaign using this particular tool. I mean, there are other ways to do it, but for the purposes of this demo, we're gonna do it this way. So social engineering toolkit. This one's kind of good because I showed someone this morning and it was kind of like, wow, that didn't take long. So basically, yep, it's wizard driven. So you're like, all right, well, I want to do a social engineering attack, pick one. And I want to do a web site attack, pick 2. And I would like to get some credentials, pick 3. And see, we're going through this pretty quickly. And now it's like, oh, let's do a web template. All right, yep, that IP address looks good. And what do I want it to look like? And you can clone websites, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to go, I want it to look like Google. Cool. Cool. All right, so that's running. All right, so it's now just sitting there waiting. And if I go over here, okay, so I'm just going to draft a quick email. All right, so what can we put in here? I am proposal that you wanted. I'm sure if I was a real social engineer person, I'd probably come up with something a little bit more convincing than this, but dear Fred, please see the proposal you requested attached below. Cool. Thanks, George. All right. And now what I'm going to do is we'll make it look like a button, right? So let's just do a table. I like tables. View, attachment. This won't take long. Getting there. And what's a good button color? Ooh, there we go. That's a good button color. And don't like borders. All right, cool. And by the way, I don't know if it's going to work. I haven't tried this yet, but we're about to find out. And now, what your normal attacker would do is they wouldn't use the IP address. So I prepared a URL earlier. So if I go back over here, and by the way, if you hit this URL, it's not going to work. So because it's internal to me. Sorry, need a public domain name. All right. Okay, cool. All right, that'll do. Let's be here all night. That's me. So Fred Flintstone. All right, cool. Now let's hope there's a good chance that spam will catch it, but we're about to find out. So I will just, you know, if Google is doing its job, it'll go, oh, this looks dodgy. We're about to find out. Guess not. All right. So as you can see, it's come through to this Gmail account. This often happens when a real mailbox is compromised. Obviously, I didn't compromise my own mailbox. I just had access to it. But now, if I click on this link, okay, see what's happened here? I clicked on the link and it's taking me to this page. Obviously, that's not right. But hey, it looks pretty convincing. So I am going to put in oh no, my name is Fred, right? Sorry, Fred Flint Stone 9020 at, oh, that's all you need. I want to give me, Guy, I want to give me a password just so we know this isn't a test. Like that I haven't staged this. Well, I have staged it, but you know.
So I'm just making up a password?
Just give me any word you want.
Cats become dogs. All one word, all lowercase.
Cats become dogs, okay. Hit sign in and, oh, that was weird. Took me to the Google page, strange. Oh well, anywho, if I go back to here, was that the password? So anyway, point is, I just fished myself. I know that's less impressive than fishing someone else, but hey, whatever I typed in those fields is now captured on the back end on this other system here, which I can now use to gain access to that mail account. So fun. I guess things like, you know, multi-factor authentication, which is one of the ACSC Essential 8, would prevent the effectiveness of this happening. As you can see though, when it redirected, which is very common in a lot of these attacks, it redirects you back to the legitimate site. But yeah, and then you're like, oh, that was weird. And then you basically just try again and then it works. So that is really quickly how you can do a phishing campaign.
Well, that was pretty bloody cool.
For a test. Only.
And I'm just going to quickly go and change all of my passwords.
Yeah, I'm hoping that, yeah, okay. Did I not mention not to use a real one? So anyway, so that is, that's one way that a threat actor can get in. And as I said, the way to fix that is generally the industry approach is to use multi-factor authentication. Obviously, use different passwords for different systems as well, not using the same password on every system. I know that that's a fairly common practice. But yeah, there you go. So that's how quickly it is to do that sort of thing, if anyone that hasn't seen that before. So I'm just going to jump out of, oh wait, when you're finished. Oh look, and then you can generate a report. That's nice. Cool. So that's easy. All right, so now what we're going to do is I have this Windows Server 2003 machine here. Cool. Now you can see I installed it yesterday because it's a 180-day eval. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly see. Oops. Okay, IP address 1.43. All right, cool. Back to Parrot. All right, so what I'm going to do is now, generally speaking, we would do a vulnerability scan just to see if it was vulnerable to anything obvious. This would take 20 minutes. So here's one I prepared earlier, as I can see here. So this is the argument here is patch, right? Make sure that your patches are up to date. This is Windows 2012 R2. It does have a high severity vulnerability, which is 401.3389, which from memory is MS17010, or for those that are familiar with it, Eternal Blue. So this is the, when sort of NotPetya and WannaCry did their rounds, and there was that, if anyone remembers, there was that NSA shadow brokers 0 day that went around. That is it. So 9.3. So let's look at that. So what I want to do is run up Metasploit. So Metasploit is, for those that, once again, are familiar with it, is a tool to basically run exploits against systems. And so, yep, there we go. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to run Metasploit. So let's see what we have. Okay, so the Eternal Blue, exploits. So the auxiliary ones are for just sort of verifying to see whether a particular system is vulnerable to an attack. We could do that, or we could just get stuck right in. So you know what? Let's just do that. Actually, no, we'll do a check. That's going to do it anyway. So if I do use, I'm going to pick one. So the PSExec one for there. Use exploit Windows SMB MS17 PSExec. Okay, cool. So what I do now is I look at some of the options. Show targets. I'm going to be lazy. I'm going to just let it pick itself. So target 0 and show options. Okay. So what is mandatory? Hosts. Yeah. Okay. So set hosts. Was my IP address 198.1.43? Yeah, sounds right. Cool. And I think that's it. So let's. Okay, cool. So check is just testing to see if that host is vulnerable. As you can see there, it is likely vulnerable, which means, oh, there we go, done. All right, so we're in that machine now. So basically it's run that exploit, and so two things here. One, patch is missing. Two, not firewalled, that's not good. Obviously for the purposes of this, I've kind of not properly secured the machine. But effectively what we've done here is I've now been able to bring up a shell on that other server. And then on the other server, you actually have no idea what's going on because it looks completely fine, but it's not.
Was it, we've got a couple of things in the chat about IP not matching.
Not matching what?
143 or 143?
Sorry. No. So 143 is this machine, this Parrot Linux. So you could, it's pre-configured localhost. Sorry, up here.
Okay.
So lhost 143. By the way, it's just DHCP. It's just given an automatic address. So 143 is the host that you're seeing right now. 43 is this one.
Okay.
Sorry, I should have explained that.
All good.
So what it's doing is it's redirecting it to port 444 on this machine that you see.
That all sounds like words. I'm just reading what's in the chat just now. Sure.
Well, so you can see down here, it says interpreter session 1 opened 1432. See, he's got one, just this bit here.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Great.
Cool. So what we could do is we could see what processes are running on the machine. As you could see, these are very much Windows processes. This is not right in front of you, a Windows machine. So obviously we're looking at my other Windows machine, my Windows machine. We could see who's logged in. Now this is important. I've actually got access to this machine as system account. Just write that down somewhere, which is basically is pretty much as high as it can get. If I was gained access as a different account, like, you know, I don't know, just a general user account, I can migrate into that and boost up that permission, but I have system, so I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, what I'm going to do now is you could do a couple things. Now, this is where I kind of snafu'd my my test environment. Is I'm a bit low on memory, so I turn this into a domain controller, which means I can't properly capture clear text passwords. But let's say what I could do is I can run, so I'm running these tools to do remote things on the other machine. But if I run up Kiwi there, I can't remember what it is, help. All right, so if I do LSA dump SAM. Okay, so what I could do is I can grab hashes of, so the basically hashed version of the passwords from the other machine, and then if they were really weak passwords, I could break them, or I could try to pass the hash to try and get access to the machine that way. But for this, I'm not going to bother with any of that. That is obviously the administrator account and its hash, but what I thought I would do instead is I would, give me a second, I thought I'd throw some malware on the machine instead. And why I'm going to do that is because we are going to get talking about app whitelisting. So execute dash f cmd.exe dash I dash h. Okay, so now I have a command prompt. That's nice. Yay. So, I mean, you're probably familiar with command prompt. In fact, if you want to see that this is the same machine, do you want to just give me the, I don't know, just give me oh, actually, you know what? I can just go back here. I can go, whoops, C temp. Okay, so if I do that, nothing. Cool. Just so we could see it's the same machine. Hello. Oh, that's a very original name. Yeah. There, see? So, hello. All right, so what I'm going to do, and this is a bit where I'm probably going to mess something up, but we'll give it a crack. Oh, you know what? I think I did type it down because it was so long. I did. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to download my test malware. Cool. So just to kind of flip back here, this has appeared. Wasn't there before. And what I'm going to do is if we go into, yeah, cyber victim, you know, we've got some files in here, some docx files, some xlsx files, that sort of thing. So this is the sort of thing that's kind of happening right now, except it's the one, you know, where instead of getting in this way, because typically most machines are behind firewalls, you know, people are coming in through, or threat actors are coming in through remote desktop, and they're brute forcing or they're phishing, and they're getting it that way, and then basically doing, you know, this sort of thing. If I just go malware, oops, malware test.exe. Okay, cool. And if I go back here, right, now we're in trouble. So that's pretty much that. What I am going to do though now is I might just copy just for the sake of simplicity. You don't have any questions on that just while I'm quickly copying this file over into here?
Not I can see. I think everyone's just rather compelled.
Fair enough. So, you know, I guess the thing here is that what could happen is someone could download, the other way, someone could download a malicious binary and run it, and then you might have the same scenario. So I know someone asked about app whitelisting before, and if we look at group policy, there is an app whitelisting tool in group policy. So as an example, if I go into group policy, and by the way, you would normally create a policy for this. Once again, this is my dodgy demo environment, so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to edit the default domain policy. But what I'm going to do is security settings. So down here, I'm just going to make this big. We've got application control policies, which this is AppLocker. And so what we can do is, which is pretty simple. Hang on, I've got to make sure I do this, otherwise I can potentially block Windows executables and stuff from running, which would not be ideal. All right, so I've created these default policies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a rule, and I'm going to say that deny. So I'm creating an AppLocker rule now. Cyber victim. Next. let's just block a path. So what typically what would happen is you could, block a publisher, a path, a file hash. The problem with the AppLocker that I find is there's a lot more configuration, whereas some other products tend to, be a little bit more, I guess, intuitive and easier to use. Where this, you kind of have to go through and sort out what exactly it is you want to block, and so forth. So anyway, I'm just going to block. I don't want this user to downloads. So if they download anything on the internet, we don't want that to be any executables. We don't want those to run. Give me a second. I just want to make sure that this is. Yep, cool. All right. So next. And if you wanted to create any exceptions, next. Sure, create. Okay, cool. So I just put that in the wrong place. So I blocked it for them. So any executables that will appear in this path now, and typically this is the tricky part, is things like, the program files directory or Windows directory would typically be excluded in an AppLocker policy, but once again, you have to be careful, and if you do that, make sure practicing least privilege so that users can't write into those folders. What I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly log this user off and log in as my other user. Sorry, I've only got like one machine here, so I can't remember the password. Password 1. Sweet. All right. If this worked. Cross fingers. You should have this, and did that run? I don't think that worked. Look at that. See, demo gods didn't work. Totally worked earlier. I swear that's what I typed. While I'm doing this, any other comments? Oh, looks like there's some questions up there.
Oh, there's loads now. As soon as we prompt them, of course, they flood in. I say we just keep going with this. It's gone so far over my head, but I'm sure a lot of people are getting a lot out of it.
So users subpath. Oh, that does say to block it. All right. Well, there's only one other reason why that might. Okay. So we do the. We'll do the old GP update. Possibly that. So one of the things that I will say, let's say this hypothetically.
A lot of people saying use the force in the chat.
All right. All right. Fair call.
What are all of you people talking about? You should all do IT masters. I should do an IT masters. I should probably do an IT.
It's not playing ball with me. Anyway, I won't sit here mucking around with this, but what I will say though is one thing that I was going to mention is that if you go to, and when I said before, we talk about the system account, one of the limitations with AppLocker specifically is, where is it? Is that. So let's say hypothetically my AppLocker policy was working. It wouldn't be able to stop me running that exploit because I was running under the system account. So that's where I think it highlights that importance of, defense in depth and making sure that patching happens and least privilege and, firewalls and malware detection, all that sort of stuff. So, I guess my point is that, one control is typically, not typically, but in almost every case, not sufficient. and that, you know, you need to put in other controls as well to help defend against those threats, because let's say hypothetically my AppLocker did work, it would still not have worked against that Metasploit Eternal Blue exploit. So that was that. So yeah, that was the demo. Hopefully that was interesting. I know I kind of went over it pretty quickly.
Yeah,
But, you know, it mostly worked.
No, I have no idea what the hell you just did, but but I wouldn't. A lot of people were saying it was cool and interesting in the chat, and certainly something, no doubt, that people will be able to go back and look at and sort of play with the tools. And I imagine they can get their hands on these tools and play with it themselves.
Yeah, both Parrot and Kali, they're free downloads. They're about a 4 gig ISO that you can just download from their respective websites. Yeah, I think the torrent is probably the quickest way to pull it down, because the direct downloads are pretty slow. Like, I think I did a direct download because I didn't want to install BitTorrent, and it took like, I don't know, like 20 hours. It was like super slow. But yeah, you can just download that and, you know, run it on VMware Player, or if you've got a spare laptop floating around that you have nothing to do with, pop it on there, and yeah, off you go.
Fantastic.
So, yeah.
Cool. People asking for files to play with as well. So wondering if maybe we can get a forum thread to talk about, I guess, how to run through these demos themselves or something.
Yeah, so for the purposes of this, obviously the malware test, you can probably see my little Visual Studio icon open down the bottom there. I created something rather than obviously using live malware. Just, I didn't want to like ransomware myself. I'm sure it's happened. And obviously we can't really distribute anything malicious, but yeah, let me have a think about whether there's something we can do to just, you know, something that's benign effectively that you can test with.
Yeah,
because that was benign. I mean, that was, I mean, it looked bark was a lot worse than its bite. But my point was, like, if I'd executed anything that was malicious, it would have done its thing. So
yeah, super cool. All right, well, there's heaps of questions, of course. So I might say, well,
I think I'm pretty much bang on the hour there. So
yeah, good job. That was really nice. So if anyone wants to hang around for a few answers to some of the questions that have been sent in, hang around. Of course, the recording will be around tomorrow. Within sort of 24 hours, we try and get it done. So, all right, let's just go through some of the questions.
Ivana has my screen share so I can see them.
Yeah, no worries. Ivana has asked, what are your thoughts on LastPass? Is it secure, and would you recommend it?
Yeah, so I am a very big advocate for password managers. I mean, there is a little bit of a, you know, there's some question or some concerns obviously around cloud-based password managers. I mean, I've used LastPass, and you probably see my icon down the bottom there. I've used Dashlane, and you know, they're a good solution because they, for me, my belief is, you know, they promote good password hygiene. So talking before about, you know, password reuse and weak passwords, you can solve a lot of that with a password manager like, you know, LastPass and Dashlane. I guess the key thing there is, you know, make sure that obviously your master password is very, very strong, and also make sure that you turn on those secondary features like, you know, multi-factor authentication, which those have. Sorry, someone just put a funny comment in that box. LastPass. But anyway, yeah, so I definitely would encourage the use of a password manager, and yeah, LastPass is a, in my opinion, but obviously do your own due diligence, but you know, is one that, you know, that is well known and fairly well respected. I know that maybe a couple of years ago they did have a quote breach. You can Google that, that's obviously public knowledge, where someone had been able to obtain the database of passwords of the users. I guess the thing there that they came back with, which, you know, and my understanding of how these systems work is that, you know, they were encrypted, and to decrypt them, you need the decryption key, which is typically client side when you log in using the LastPass client, and it's your password. So that goes back again to making sure that your master password is really strong.
Beauty, thank you. And we might start cutting some questions off now. Say anything after James's question. And
I'm just going to answer that first one really quick. Greenburn is free. It is, so OpenVAS is what I was using. That's the vulnerability scanner. It is on the distributions of those Linux distributions.
All right. That was right up the top, wasn't it? Greenbone. Yep, we've got that one live, and we'll go from the top there. How can one become super good at cybersecurity? Musunguzi. Apart from studied IT masters, perhaps.
Look, I think cybersecurity is one of those tough areas because it's very broad and very complex. But I think it really comes down to you know, a combination of experience and education. And I mean, yes, studied IT masters. Education will, to be completely honest, only get you part of the way. You still need to, you know, and for the people that are, you know, the inquisitive minds, the people that like to you know, tinker and that sort of thing, I find, because I'm like that, and like, you know, like to, you know, play with different systems and see how they you know, integrate, and what I can, you know, and see what the best practices are in terms of securing them and those sorts of things. I mean, that's really both education as well as, you know, experience and self-learning. So and it takes time. You know, it does take time, but I think it's a very rewarding career. It's very interesting, and there's never a dull moment.
Great. The Nutrigrain effect, you only get out what you put in.
That's right.
Rohit has asked if you've seen any organisation that has implemented application whitelisting 100% across their technology landscape.
That's a loaded question.
Why do you say that?
Because I think I know who that is. And not one of mine. But anyway, so yes, there are organizations that have done it. And I think one of the key challenges that, and I was on a roundtable only a couple of days ago, one of the key challenges with app whitelisting is shifting from you know, that sort of partial enforcement to that full enforcement mode where you're actually stopping executables from running and not just confirming. So I've been in organizations before where you kind of go in there and, you know, app whitelisting is running, but all it's saying is like, oh, you want to run this, put in why you want to run it, and then it'll let you run it anyway. And that's not really that effective because people just get used to going, yeah, whatever. And so there are a few organizations that have gone the whole hog and literally locked it all down so that you need, you know, administrator or security intervention to run unapproved executables. So yes, it's I've done it. Like, so that's the loaded part of that question. And it was not as scary as, you know, it was kind of made out to be. But once again, that comes down to a lot of planning and you know, making sure that you've got the right solution in place. So, but it is absolutely achievable.
And no doubt important to communicate it properly. And
that's right.
Yeah. I'd love it to not have that freedom. Sarah, you asked about a document regarding 27,001. Could you please elaborate on that one, and we'll try and help you out. 27,001 evidence. Is that?
What was that document called? Oh, statement of applicability.
Cool.
Yeah, so it's a statement of applicability. So what it is, it's a list of the Annex A controls, which are listed in the 27002 document. But basically, what happens is an organization that's got certification will mark off which ones are applicable to their certification. and it might be, a small handful, or it might be all of them. So, in our case, we are all but one control. So 113 out of 114 are applicable. So at that point, if I, as someone reviewing that, I'll be like, okay, well, you've got 113 that were in scope that were audited by an external auditor. Therefore, I think that, you've got a very broad scope that covers a lot versus, maybe just one particular segment, but it's called the SOA.
Thank you. Shannon Olson asks, more questions on frameworks. Do you have a view on the relatively recent inclusion of cybersecurity principles and govern, protect, detect, respond breakdown in the ISM compared to the NIST CSF functions, ostensibly as part of the move from compliance-based to a risk-based approach?
Hang on a second, that's a very long question.
Yeah, it was. Good question, no? I hope. So much of this is well above my awareness, but
look, I haven't analyzed that in depth. I do like that approach, though. I do like breaking things down into those sort of categories. It makes it a lot easier than just having like an overwhelming list of hundreds of controls. And I think that, the risk-based approach, which is certainly the approach that I take and has been the approach that I've taken for a number of years, seems to work a lot better rather than just doing an instructional, well, you shall do this and like why. It is better to understand your risks and address them. I think one of the challenges that you have with that risk-based approach, which I think was one of those criticisms, as I said, even around ISO, is, have you identified all of your risk, and then how are you assessing that risk? And so the two types of risk assessment approaches are generally, they are qualitative and quantitative risk. And while quantitative risk is, easy to determine how risky something is because it's a actual figure, like, well, if you do this, you're going to lose $1 million. Ooh, that's bad. Qualitative risk obviously is subject to interpretation, and then it depends on who's making those assessments as to how risky something is, and then subsequently how good the program is going to be based on the controls that are then selected based on something that is so experience driven and not really that potentially solid. So yeah.
thank you. Jeff asks, how can we implement the ACSC Essential 8 in an organization that has a bring your own device policy for most of the user computers?
That's a great question. So I think you're going to struggle with that. So things like patching, and I guess it's going to be very policy driven, right? So your BYOD policy, I think, is going to have to include at least some of the ASCSC Essential 8. I think you're going to struggle with app whitelisting, to be perfectly honest. Basically telling people to bring their own devices that they can't run the software that they want is probably going to be a little bit hard. But things like, patching applications and patching operating systems, I think that'd be, fairly, it'll be easier to mandate that. The problem is, though, the maturity level is not going to be that good, because if it's BYOD, unless you're, if you're controlling it with a, with an MDM type solution, like an Intune or something like that, then you may have a bit more control around, well, if they don't patch, then you can use conditional access to block the ability for them to actually gain access to resources. MFA, you probably already do if you're doing BYOD. But if you like connect into cloud, so just make that as a bit of assumption there. Same deal with backup. A lot of that is held with possibly providers or using some sort of cloud storage. But yeah, I think you're going to struggle with some of those controls, like app whitelisting. You're probably going to struggle telling those BYD users that they can't have administrative privileges too. The Office macro thing you could probably get away with, but you're going to need to rely on some sort of management platform to lock that down. But yeah, I'm not sure you can fully implement the Essential 8 that easily.
So is that an argument against BYOD policies, or just a lot harder to control if you do choose to do it?
It's not against BYOD policies. It's just that it's going to be more difficult, and I guess you got to pick and choose your battles. But I think from my experience, I think you probably struggle a little bit to get the full essential 8 in to, even to to a reasonable maturity level. But I would probably try and put in as many of those controls as you can before there's before people complain too much. So.
Thank you. Max asks, do you see IDS being in the same realm as UEBA or WEBA? I'm not sure about that one.
Sorta. Except one is, network based. One is, detecting network traffic, and the other one is detecting user behavior. So, I mean, they're similar. I think the same realm. I mean, sort of. They're both more sort of active defense controls in that respect. They obviously do two different things, but they do a similar thing, just to two different mediums. One is to people, and one is to information flow, or network flow, network traffic. So yeah, I think they're both in the active defense space, if that's an answer.
Great, thank you. Andrew saying whitelisting is great, but take PowerShell. It can be used for bad as well as good, and it is signed by Microsoft.
Yeah, that's right. And so there are some tools that will actually provide more control around that. Also, then you start talking about other things like least privilege, where, okay, you can run PowerShell, but what can you actually invoke? So I think, once again, that's going to be a case of making sure that the people that can, the people that access PowerShell and have like those administrators, practice those sort of separate roles, that they're only running elevated rights when doing elevated things versus day to day. And then potentially there are, as I said, using whitelisting tools that can actually stop the use of some of those other sort of PowerShell invoke things. But it's definitely a challenge that I think I've even had, where you block command prompt, for example, but you can still run PowerShell. But and one of the ISO controls, as an example, is around restricting the use of privileged utilities. So maybe the answer is you block PowerShell, but as I said, but you only block it for certain, or you only allow it for certain use cases. Once again, I mean, no solution is going to be bulletproof. Whitelisting is the same. It will stop a good chunk of things, but yeah, it won't stop everything. And those off the land attacks are becoming more prevalent, given that malware is often detected and blocked, and those sorts of things. So yeah, it's really about configuration. And take a look at the if you haven't already, the CIS benchmarks, and they've got some good settings there on how to limit the sort of attack surface of a machine. Yeah, I just seen the other comment there. There is signing PowerShell scripts, and by default, the signing, they won't run unless you set execution policy to allow them to run. The problem is that the commands will still run. So yeah, it kind of can be a bit finicky.
Great. Bridges asked if you could maybe tease out the difference between a security audit and security testing.
Well, they're almost the same. I mean, security testing is an audit activity, right? I mean, you're testing it is an audit activity. I guess testing for the purposes of security testing is validating that a control works. Like you're testing the effectiveness of a control. It's a bit hard because, I mean, I feel like you do that in audit too. So like audit for me is like, well, is the control there? Yeah, does it work? And you do that through a testing process. There we go. Maybe that's the answer I'm looking for. So I feel like they're very closely interrelated. So you're doing the testing for the purposes of auditing the control versus, yeah, no, I think that's probably how I would explain it.
Great, thank you.
Better definition, feel free.
Yeah, and I suppose these are all.
By the way, the one above, that one about the free vulnerability assessment tool, yeah, that OpenVAS that was on the Greenborn thing, that is the UI isn't the best UI in the world, but it is free and it does work. So also Tenable Nessus for home use give you like 15 IPs for free. Well, they used to, I think they still do. But other than that, yeah, OpenVAS is the well-known one that's part of a lot of those security bundle distributions.
Thank you. On auditing again, Shannon asks, what about event collection and forwarding or monitoring as a detective control?
Week 3.
Sorry?
Week 3.
Oh, very good. Oh, signposting, excellent. Stay tuned, Shannon.
But
Sarah,
yes, that is absolutely a detective control, and we will cover that. And did I say that we're doing demos in week 3 too? Yeah.
very exciting. Sarah finds social engineering fascinating, specifically when it comes to imposters. How do hackers learn how to do this? It seems like it takes a high degree of IQ and EQ to do this, but is this accurate?
As in like impersonating other people? I'm guessing that's what that means. So,
or just getting close enough to people to glean information, I suppose.
yeah, I mean, well, yeah, so I'm trying to work out if this is like, you know, phishing related, or are we talking like social engineering in person? So, yeah, look, I think that in both instances there needs to be, you know, a certain level of I guess, manipulation is not quite the right word, but well, maybe it is the right word, but manipulating someone into you know, behaving a certain way, hence the sort of engineering part. And with like if I talk about imposters and I think about phishing as an example, you know, a lot of that comes because when someone gets access to a mailbox, they go flicking through to see if there's other conversations that have been happening, and they kind of inject themselves, so they have a bit of background. And I don't think it takes a lot of skill to kind of just intercept into that. But if it's something in terms of, you know, almost kind of not befriending somebody, but, you know, like trying to manipulate somebody into doing something. And I use the example of physical social engineering where you're trying to, you know, get into an office. A lot of the time it is just people's good nature to let someone to open the door for somebody and to hold it for somebody. And so taking advantage of that is kind of how a lot of these attacks happen. And, you know, you can just drill into everybody the policies around making sure that you don't let anyone follow you in, that you know, especially if you don't know them, and that, you know, everyone has to swipe. But at the end of the day, people are just being polite. So I think by human nature, a lot of these social engineering attacks just happen. You know, so in those instances, you're being polite. In the instances with fraud, it's either because, you know, you're worried something bad is going to happen, even though something bad is actually currently happening, something is urgent, or you're curious by nature. So, you know, that's how a lot of these things just kind of become successful. And the attackers are getting better, and they're making businesses out of this sort of stuff, right? So there's basically, you know, enterprises that are, I mean, going back to that kind of organized crime thing, purely around generating revenue from this. So,
Which you shouldn't do.
you definitely shouldn't.
Anonymous attendee asks, what are the key metrics you consider relevant for board reporting?
Well, I like to ask them, but before I do that, because usually they'll go, look, I don't know. It depends what you can collect, right? So things and what's important. So and obviously the technicality of the board, like how technical are they? Sorry, how technical are they? You know, metrics like, you know, vulnerabilities, risk profile, those sorts of things are pretty important, I think. You know, number of incidents, if any, hopefully not. You know, things like, you know, if you're running any current like tests, like if you're running a phishing campaign or something like that, it's useful for them to know how that's going. It might be useful for security awareness training, how that's going, and like, you know, how's it sort of tracking. So it really depends, I guess, what the board wants, what tools that you have access to, and that you and things that you can actually measure. And then, you know, obviously try and keep it at a very high level and try and avoid a lot of the technical mumbo jumbo in there. But yeah, it's really, I mean, yeah, it really depends, but those are the sorts of things that I typically, report. So, yeah, without pulling up a report.
Thank you. Bridget asks, do we talk of passive defense for next-gen firewalls that are continuously inspecting traffic at all?
Yeah, so this is almost kind of going into like hybrid mode where, the passive stuff is that sort of, the sort of, the rules that just say, okay, well, what is this port, blah, 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 80, okay, cool. And then when you're getting to the sort of advanced features where you're starting to use things like, I guess, AI and those sorts of things, that's where you're kind of getting into more active defense. So generally speaking, firewalls have been traditionally passive, but I think there's starting to become a little bit of a shift into more active features. I think I guess they're still kind of mostly in the passive category, but as everything, it kind of evolves and moves along to being a little bit more on the active side. So maybe this one's a little bit on the fence.
Yeah, Annie, thank you. Ignacio's asked a question, or perhaps it's one that was there already. Are there comparative benefits or disbenefits between NIST and ISO? Another good reminder, I think, just to tell your stories in the forum. We could probably run a short course on which to apply when. It might be a bit dry, but super interesting at the same time for those that are keen on it, I reckon. Yeah, just worth really playing with in the forum, I think. So have fun.
Yeah, and the next one below that, next week, we're going to talk about SEAM.
Okay,
So,
great. Thanks, Damien. And yeah, we'll also chuck in, we'll have a think first and figure out how we can sort of let you have a bit of a play with similar things to what George was demonstrating tonight in the resource section on the course page. Thanks, Amy. Is that using Burp Suite in the backend to capture the user logins?
what?
That would probably have been just as you were starting the demo.
Oh, sorry, that was Mimikatz. Sorry, that was Kiwi. Yeah, it wasn't Burp Suite. So typically I'd use Burp Suite when I'm doing, well, when I used to do web application testing, where I was like, capturing, doing SQL injections and things like that. That was Kiwi.
Thanks. I do like these names. Okay, Raghavendra asks, is it to get credentials or it actually gets you the shell of where? Sorry, Raghavendra, maybe just chuck a bit more context in there and we'll get to that one. Ignacio again, I hear that MFA is not 100% secure. In other words, it can also be broken or hacked. Can you please comment?
I don't think anything is 100% secure. Does that comment? No. So
Okay, yep.
I don't think anything is 100% secure. There are definitely, there are definitely vulnerabilities in pretty much everything, or someone's going to figure it out at some point. There are certain types of MFA that are going to be more secure than others. For example, using a text message is typically seen as less secure because it's transmitted over the phone network. The other thing that happens very in some instances is it's not even the fault of MFA. It's where you get the MFA thing and the attacker's like, oh, can you just read out the code, because they've social engineered the person. There's stuff like that happens. So it is absolutely not 100% secure, but it is more secure than not having it. And it's, for the most part, it's a very good control. I guess, if we go MFA and go to biometrics, now notwithstanding that thing, the gummy bears and the fingerprints, any of the sort of like, biometrics again is typically going to be more difficult because, those things are kind of attached to you, except where there's a problem with the platform, like the whole gummy bear thumbprint thing. So yeah, it's not 100% secure. It can be broken, but that varies depending on what the factor is. As I said, whether the person's being engineered, or where there's vulnerabilities in that particular factor being used. So, or in the platform itself.
related to MFAs, do you find that MFA tokens can be easily obtained by modern day tools?
So are we talking about like duplicating tokens? Is that what?
Well, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Well, chuck us in a retype if you're still around. Is Eternal Blue noisy? Can it be detected?
Yeah, it can be. It can be detected if you've got the right detection tools in place. So that's the short answer. Yes, it can be. And I'm hoping to be able to do that next week. So
Right.
give it a crack. So
Oh,
next week is going to be a bit more on the detection stuff. So it's going to be a lot more around threat hunting rather than being the threat.
Okay, great. I'm
and the victim.
I'm conscious that it's already not 9 o'clock Eastern time. So maybe we'll just whip through them real quick. And thanks again so much for your generosity with your time. If the target machine had antivirus, could it have prevented the remote exploit?
Probably not. Depends. If it had something that was like a advanced endpoint threat platform that was detecting funny network connections and weird process spawns and things like that, then yes. If it was your sort of old school antivirus, then not really. So yeah, and then certainly my malware test would not have been detected because I literally compiled it today. So there's and it didn't really do anything. So it would have been, you know, like a kind of 0-day thing. So there's not really much that would have been able to detect there, unless once again it was a more advanced product that was able to detect, you know, weird behavior processes and things like that happening. So I can't definitively answer that because it really depends on what's on the machine that's being attacked.
Okay, probably another depends question. How would you track where the crypt files come from?
Well, they came from the original files that the malware hit, right? So they came from nowhere. They were just the same files. They were just messed up. So you would have to do it, and I think stepping back from that, you'd have to look at where the threat came from. In which case, you would look at a forensic investigation. And in terms of a forensic investigation, you would look at things like firewall traffic, you would look at things like seam logs, and we're going to, as we'll talk about that next week with the sort of detection stuff, but that's how you would sort of backtrack it. Unfortunately, and we will talk about that, is, you know, even if you do that and you find where the traffic, where the attacker came from, you still may get absolutely nowhere. We'll cover why next week, I think.
Okay. Ian asks, have you done security assessment on SCADA systems? What are the risks of using open source programs in SCADA systems?
I personally haven't. Not that I can recall. No, I mean, I'm even thinking like way back. No, most of my stuff hasn't been on SCADA. So yeah, and I probably can't comment on the risks.
Alrighty, that'll get us out of that question.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I know how they typically used to be secured, which was not very well, but I can't say I've got first-hand experience of that.
Beauty. Yeah. Well, maybe another thing to.
I hear they're much better now.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, chuck it in the forum. Have a chat. Go for it. Would updating hashes in advanced threat detection or EDR products assist by stopping the download of the malware?
Hashes maybe, but only if it was something that was previously identified. So if it was like a 0-day or something like that, then hashes would have been completely useless. But yeah, I mean, if it was a well-known or like a previously identified piece of malware, and you downloaded the hash, then it, in theory, would stop it or detect it and quarantine it or do whatever it is it needs to do.
Thank you. Gary's asked, if someone gets onto the machine with full access, then can a hacker sort of revoke the setting up of a whitelist?
Yes.
terrifying.
They can.
Can whitelisting be used to allow applications from under?
Well, that's what it does. So you basically, so whitelisting, the concept of whitelisting is to blacklist everything. And then once you blacklist everything, what you allow is what goes on your whitelist. And that's what you're allowed to run.
Beauty. Thanks.
That makes sense.
Yep. James Davies asks, can you set firewall changes to notify the owner/root from systems privileges, like two-factor authentication methods?
Depends on the firewall. So I know that, for example, and this isn't a firewall, but I know with Office 365, you can put, you can use the logs to identify when the auth changes. So when you disable two-factor, and then you can create alerts for that sort of thing. You know, providing you've got full logging on your firewalls, it should be possible. But I think it would depend on the firewall and what it logs and how it's configured. And so typically you might have to rely on something like a SIEM or another product that would ingest those logs and then look for those triggers and then set off the alerts, unless the firewall natively has all that built in. But yeah, that's going to depend on the platform.
Thank you. Linda, on frameworks, if a company adopts the NIST cybersecurity framework, is it necessary to consider ISO 27001 certification, or can we do with one for compliance?
So this is an interesting question. So I think at the end of the day, it's up to the business to decide whether they want to do NIST, ISO, or both, or neither, or something else. So it is absolutely not necessary to do ISO unless the organization determines that it needs to be done. What does happen fairly often, at least in my experience, is that sometimes other organizations, like a major client, if you're in a client-facing organization, may want you to do 27001, in which case you might be lumped with doing both. So yeah, I think that's a hard one to answer, and I think ultimately it's a business decision which one they do. I know it's a bit of a cop-out answer, but you know, it isn't necessary is the bottom line, unless there's a reason that it needs to be done, whether that be because, you know, some external stakeholder said that you needed it, or whether the board said that you needed it, or whatnot. You just won't get certification with the NIST cyber framework.
Thank you. Craig asks, does Metasploit typically work through host firewalls, such as the default Windows firewall, for example, on one of the typically open ports?
Yeah, okay, so the answer to that is yes, if it's on an open port and it's vulnerable. But, you know, if it's not, then no. So, you know, in this example, I had to turn off the Windows firewall because the Linux instance was not seen on the trusted network, therefore all network traffic was blocked. I guess I could have just punched a hole was it the SMB one that I used? So I could have just punched a hole in TCP 445 in the firewall, and I might just try that after, and that should have worked. So, but yes, if a firewall is up, it's going to struggle to get through there unless there's something wrong with the firewall. But if the port is open, then it's going to, you know, typically allow the traffic through.
Cool, thank you. Mike asks, would you use whitelisting for just malware protection, or also to prevent hackers from running commands like ARP and CMD?
No, I would use it for preventing anything that I don't want run. So I'd use it to, yeah, I'd use it to prevent the use of malware. You know, you're preventing ARP and CMD. Obviously, when you're starting to do things like that, you need to be careful that you're not going to inadvertently break something else. Well, probably not so much ARP, but CMD maybe. Yeah, I mean, I typically would, you know, CMD for sure, I would definitely restrict. You could do it with whitelisting, or you could do it with, you know, group policy or something like that. But yeah, I would use it to, you know, lock down executables as best that I could, as long as the system still runs.
Glenn's asked, how would you go with IP spoofing if the system was firewalled?
How would you go with IP spoofing if the system was firewalled?
Hmm.
So can we a bit more on that?
Yeah,
Trying to work out for what.
Send us something in, Glenn, if you've
Yeah.
got more. Bernard asks, how effective are antivirus in terms of security? There are so many antivirus products in the market. When selecting an antivirus for a company, what are things to be looked at?
How long is a piece of string? So effective, antivirus has its place. There's the argument around, we talk about app whitelisting, right? And, there's even the argument that, well, if you've got app whitelisting, do you even need antivirus because the viruses can't run? That's popped up as a question. If you can't execute it, then how could it possibly do anything bad? So, there's still a place for it, and I still believe in that, layered defense approach where you're not just relying on one particular thing. Is antivirus going to stop everything? Absolutely not. Will it help? Sure, probably, most likely, but you need multiple sort of controls in place to kind of limit that risk. And even then, it's still not 100% guaranteed, right? So, which I know, once again, sounds like kind of easy answer out, but it's not. At the end of the day, your user could do something that tips all your security controls upside down. So there are a lot of antiviruses in the market. Some of those newer ones, they're becoming a bit more lightweight. They're starting to leverage things like AI and machine learning, is it really AI yet? ML. They're starting to, not even really do much in terms of relying on signatures anymore. They might still have signatures, but they're almost secondary to some of the more advanced detection features. So yeah, look, is it effective? It is. It does have some effect, but it is definitely not a complete solution. I think you need some extra things on there, like least privilege, like Windows firewall if you're running Windows, obviously AV, and then if you can, app whitelisting.
Great, thanks. James asks, have you seen anything good for applications allow listing for Linux that is comprehensive from an enterprise perspective? I use CMD to enforce MFA and third-party approval of risky changes.
Sorry, have you seen anything good for application allow listing for Linux? Is that application whitelisting?
Let's say yes.
But then I use CMD to enforce MFA and third-party approval of risky. Wait, use CMD as in command prompt on Linux?
CMD.com from James in the chat.
So you run that on Linux, okay, and third-party approval of risky changes. So I'm not across any app whitelisting tools for Linux. I'm not familiar with any. I basically just use my security tools in Linux. I haven't really used it as a sort of enterprise environment. Maybe that's something we could take in the forum or something. I can have a look a bit more at.
Okay, great.
I'm not sure on that one.
Beauty. Yeah.
And Nessus, Tenable Nessus was the answer to the bottom one.
Tenable Nessus.
Sorry, and that's from a free perspective. There's a very small like IP license for like 15 users that you can do in Tenable Nessus. Otherwise, if you're looking at not OpenVAS but any vulnerability management solution, then OpenVAS, Nessus, or Tenable, Qualys, Rapid7. There's 4, 5.
Beauty. Thank you. That's wonderful. That's over 100 questions tonight. Not all of them we could get to, I'm sorry, but still an amazing effort. And thanks heaps, George, for hanging around. It's very generous of you. Well done, everyone, on hanging around. There's still about 300 people out there. Thanks heaps also to Rebecca and Hannah for hanging around. We'll catch you next week. I'll throw to you, George, to say goodnight.
Yeah, and if I just saw James has put some other bits in there, so if we can just get those into the forums, I'll come back to those. But yeah, thanks everyone. Good night. I hope you enjoy that. And yeah, next week let's talk about detection, which will answer some of the other questions. So yeah, have a good evening, everyone.